In this tutorial, we're going to learn how to use Adobe Bridge to review the images we've shot for an assignment, how to select the images we want to submit for the assignment, and how to use the Adobe Bridge to open the camera raw files and process them in Photoshop so that we can save them as JPEGs to turn them in. At its core, Adobe Bridge is an image browsing program that allows you to view a variety of formats. In this class, we'll be using it to preview camera raw images. It basically works in two ways. It allows you to look at thumbnails of your images and larger preview images based on those camera raw files so that we can edit our images and select the ones we want to get into Photoshop and to ultimately submit for our assignments. There are two basic ways to open a folder of images to view in Bridge. The first is to use the sidebar to navigate to where the folder you want to view is located. In this case, I'm going to be viewing this folder called Sort that's on my desktop. If I double click on that folder, it will open the folder and show me thumbnails of all of the images. Now, it may take a little time for the thumbnails to load depending on how many images you have. The second way to view a folder of images is if you know where that folder is located, you can actually drag it to the Bridge icon in the dock, and that will load the thumbnails into Bridge as well. In the last tutorial, we learned how to batch rename a group of photos inside of a folder. But what happens if you have more than just your assignment on your card? Using Adobe Bridge, we can quickly rename and move each of the different groups of photos into folders for our editing needs. I've loaded a folder called Sort that's stored on my desktop. And if you look at the thumbnails, you can see there's two different things here. One are some waves at the jetty, and the other is a police standoff following a robbery at a local motorcycle shop. With these thumbnails, even at this size, it's pretty easy to see where one assignment ends and the other begins. If you need to increase the size of the thumbnails to make it easier to determine where one assignment begins and the other ends, you can use the zoom slider at the bottom of the Bridge window. Since in this case it's very easy to determine between the two sets of photos, I'm actually going to set the slider smaller so that I can see one assignment and the other all in the same window. I'm going to start by selecting all of the images in the wave group. I'm going to click on the first image in the set and then move down to the last image in the set and hold down the Shift key and click on the final image in the set. That will select the entire group of images. The next step is to rename them. So I can go to the Tools menu again up here and hit Batch Rename, or I can use the keyboard shortcut Command Shift and R to bring up the dialog. I'm just going to call these McKenna, Waves, and the date that your next assignment is due. Now before I hit Rename, since the next thing I want to do is move these images into a folder, I like to call my folders the same thing as the images. So to save myself some time, I'm actually going to come in here, highlight the file name I've just typed in, hit Command-C on the keyboard to copy it, and then I'll hit Rename. Now that I've renamed these files, I want to put them into a folder with the same name. So I'm going to go up to the File menu again, select Move To, and in this case I want to select Choose Folder. That will allow me to create a new folder where I want it, and it'll also allow me to name that folder. So by default, it should go back to where these images are at, which is in the Sort folder, and I'm going to click on New Folder, and then I'm going to hold down the Control key and hit Paste. That pastes in the file name that I just copied from the other window. I'm going to delete the period though so that the computer doesn't think there's a missing extension for that folder. Hit Create, hit Open, and it will move the images into that folder you just created. To rename the second set of photos, I can click on one, hit Command-A, and now if I went straight to the Rename tool, I'd actually end up renaming that folder we just created and moved our other images to. So I want to scroll down and find that folder and hold down the Command key and click on it. That will unselect that folder. And then I can go ahead, hit Command-Shift-R, and follow the steps to rename that second set of images, and then follow the steps to move them into a separate folder. There are two main workspaces in Adobe Bridge that we'll be using in this class. The first one is Essentials. That's the one we've been using so far. But the other one we'll take a look at is Film Strip. We'll look at both of them and how they work in the editing process. So far we've been in the Essentials workspace. But let's take a look at some of the other things it can do. For example, if I select on a thumbnail, if I look over on the right, I can see this area where there's a preview image. And then I also see this thing that says metadata. Now if I look right here, That's my camera settings, my f-stop, my shutter speed, and what ISO I was at. It also tells me some other things like it was at auto white balance and that my metering was on centered. You'll also see over here it has the file name, says that it's a camera raw image. It gives me the pixel dimensions and the file size. Down here you'll see some camera data. It tells me what kind of lens I was using, where it was zoomed to, again the aperture, and it'll have some other things like the type of camera and whether or not a flash fired. Once we've renamed and organized our files, the next step in the editing process is to actually go through the images and select the ones we want to process in Photoshop. Now, we can do this in Essentials, but I find that the other workspace film strip is a little bit more helpful in previewing my images with a larger view so that I can see which images I actually want to choose to work on. Switching between the two workspaces we'll be using is a very simple task. Simply go up to the upper right of the application window. You should see Essentials highlighted in orange. To switch to the film strip mode, just click on Film Strip, and you'll see that the window changes. Now we have a very large preview, and you can see that at the bottom of the application window, we have a row of our thumbnails. As we browse our images with Adobe Bridge, we're going to use a star rating system that's built into the program to choose the images we want to process later. Is to scroll through the images and add a star rating to the ones that you think you want to process. Start by making sure that your slider in the thumbnail window is all the way to the left so you can start at the beginning of your images. You can then use the arrow key to go through and preview each one. When you find an image that you want or that you think you might want to process, we can add a star rating to it in a few different ways. The first, going up to Label and adding stars. Now remember, we talked about keyboard shortcuts and how Adobe will have them listed in the menu. The easiest way for me is to just use the Command 5 option once I'm on a thumbnail I want to edit. So I'm down here, I'm looking through more images, and when I find one I want, I'm going to push the Command and the 5 key to give that a 5-star rating. Now if you look over to the left, you'll notice that Filter has come up, and you have 103 images that have no rating, and we have one that has a star rating. We'll see how that works later after we select a few more images. So I'll continue to scroll through and find some images that I want to process. Now that I've gone through my folder and selected all of the images I want to work with, I want to get rid of the rest of them. Now I don't want to throw them away, I just don't want to look at them. I want to focus on the images I've selected. Now the easiest way to do that is to jump back into the Essentials window, come over to the side where you have Filter, and select on the star ratings. Now the only images I have to look at in this window are the ones that I've decided were worth processing. The next step is to start opening these images and doing a little processing with the Adobe RAW processor. The best photographers in the world, using the best equipment available, will still almost always need to do some processing to their images. And that's the next step we're going to take. We're going to open our camera raw images and do some basic processing to them. Put them into Photoshop and save them as JPEGs. I'm going to start by working on this image. Now to launch the processor, all I need to do is double click on this thumbnail. And you'll see now that it's brought up the camera raw processor. The way it works is that any of the changes we make with the tools over here on the side will actually be applied as a sidecar file. That's a separate file that will live in that folder next to your camera raw file. And we'll look at some of the things we can adjust now. The first is we can adjust the overall exposure. Whether it's too bright or too dark, we can adjust this slider and find the point where we think it looks the best. The next is contrast. That's kind of the latitude between the highlights and the shadows. So we can add a little contrast or take it away. Things that are shot on cloudy days tend to need a little more contrast added to them. We can also adjust the highlights. That's the bright areas in the image. So if something is really, really blown out, we can adjust the highlights slider and bring a little more detail back in. We can also pull detail out of the shadows or make them darker by adjusting this slider. And that same thing works with the whites and the blacks. Now there's one thing I always like to add to all of my images, and that's clarity. That's some contrast in the mid-tone range of the image. And Camera Raw, shot straight out of the camera, has a tendency to not have very sharp edges until you add some of that clarity. Play with these sliders until you get your image to look the way you want it to. Once you've gotten it where you think it's pretty good, you can go ahead and click the Open Image button down here, and that will open up Photoshop. From here, we're not going to learn how to do anything with Photoshop today. We'll do that in our next tutorial. What we're going to do now is go up to File, go to Save As, and by default it will hopefully bring you to the folder where your Camera Raw files were. Now you can see down here this little file that says XMP. That's the sidecar. That includes the star rating and any changes we make in the Camera Raw processor. But we're going to make sure that this down here says JPEG. We have our file name up here, and I actually am going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it Edits. I want to save my file in here as a JPEG. So I'm going to click Create, come down, hit Save. It's going to bring up this dialog. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the next tutorial. Just go ahead and click on the default settings for now, hit OK, and now we have our first JPEG saved to turn in. Now I'm going to close this window and go back into Bridge and show you how we can open multiple images and adjust them and open multiple images at once. So Camera Raw files can be fairly large. So depending on the computer you're working on and how much RAM it has, you may not want to try to open too many at once. That can actually slow down your processing. So I'm going to select these two images by clicking on the first one and then holding down the Command key while I click on the second one. Now instead of double clicking on these with the mouse, I'm actually going to hit the keyboard shortcut for open in almost all Adobe programs, which is the Command key and the letter O. Now instead of just having one image over here in my film strip, I have two, and that's the two images I selected. Now these are both at relatively the same exposure, so I can actually select these and adjust the exposure on both of them at the same time. I'm going to increase the exposure. I'll add a little contrast to the image, but in that increased exposure I feel like I lost a little bit of that black tone. So I'm going to bring some of that back by sliding this down. I'll add a little bit of clarity, and then I can hit Open Images. Now, depending on how big my files are, this may take a little bit of time. But now, I have my two images open, and I can go ahead and save each one of these as a JPEG into my Edits folder so that I can submit them. Again, I'll click the default settings for this. I'm going to go up here to the X and click that to shut this window and move to the next one. And then I can also skip going up to the File menu by pushing Command, Shift, and the letter S. That'll bring up the Save As dialog. Make sure I have JPEG selected, select my folder Edits, and click Save. Continue processing your raw images into JPEGs using the processor and Photoshop and saving them in your Edits folder until all of the images you need to submit for an assignment are complete. After you've completed saving the JPEGs, we'll need to copy the corresponding raw files back over with the sidecar data so I can see what changes you made to the actual image that came out of your camera using the raw processor and what adjustments you made in Photoshop. Now, we haven't done any adjustments in Photoshop in this tutorial, but again in the next one we will learn how to do additional fine-tuning of an image inside of Photoshop. At this point, you should have finished processing all of your raw images selected for an assignment into an Edits folder inside of your larger folder of images. The next step is to grab all of the raw files that correspond to those JPEGs and put them into a specific folder so you can submit both your raw files and your JPEGs. I'll show you the workflow that I think makes it the easiest to do this. If you find another way to organize these files, but still get the same files into the folders on the Google Drive for your assignments, that's fine. This is just one example of how you can do it. I've unchecked the star rating for the 5-star photos so that you can see the whole folder that we were working in. Currently, this is all of the raw files, as well as that folder Edits that we created and saved our JPEGs into. So let's jump into the Edits folder, and we can see I've only saved 3 of the images. I didn't process all of the rest of them. We can jump back out by using the navigation bar across the top up here to get back to the primary folder. So again, we have a folder that holds all of our raw files for the assignment, and we have a folder edits that has just the JPEGs we've processed. Let's start by reapplying our star filter by clicking next to the 5-star rating. And we'll see these are the images that we want to copy, the raw files and their corresponding sidecar data. If you look here, the little icon above and to the right of each individual image means that it's had some image processing applied to it in the Camera Raw processor. So, very quickly, as long as we have one image selected, we can use the keyboard shortcut Command A. Pressing the Command and the A key will select all of our images. Now the next thing we want to do is move these into a folder. But instead of using Move like we did before, we're going to use a different thing in Adobe Bridge. We're going to use the Copy action. We're going to create a new folder called Raw, and we're going to save it inside of the Edits folder and have Adobe Bridge copy the raw files and their corresponding sidecars into that folder for us so we can submit them. All right, make sure that you still have all your raw files submitted for this next step. We're going to go up to the File menu, scroll down to Copy To, and then we're going to use Choose Folder again, just like we did with Move, but we're going to use Choose Folder so that we can actually create a new folder and name it what we want. That should bring up our dialog. We should be directed to the folder where these images are stored. Now remember, we created a folder called Edits, so we want to find that one first. Now I know that Edits comes before McKenna alphabetically. We want to scroll up until we see Edits, and we're going to click on Edits to select it, and then we're going to jump down to New Folder, and we're just going to name this Raw. This is where we're going to copy the raw files and the XMP files so that I can view them and see what adjustments you made to your Camera Raw files before turning them into JPEGs. Click on Create. Next, we just click on the Open, and as you can see, it's copied them. It happened pretty quick here, but it just copied those raw files. So our next step is going to be to create a folder called JPEGs inside of that folder and move the JPEGs into them. So we've now created that raw folder and the images have been copied into it. If we go back up to the navigation across the top of the application window, we can see our folder Edits. We're currently in the raw file, but if we back up to Edits, we should see the JPEGs that we worked on. We're going to select those by clicking on the first one, holding down the Shift key, clicking on the second one, and these we're going to move. So we'll go back up to File, scroll down to Move To, and then again we're going to go over and click on Choose Folder. Because we just saved some stuff in the Camera Raw folder that we created, that's where it's going to want us to put things. So we can click on the bar that says Raw, and it should show us the parent folder, which is Edits. So we're going to drop down in the menu and let go of the mouse. We have within this folder our JPEGs and our folder we created called Camera Raw. Go back over to the new folder, or if you want to learn a new keyboard shortcut, you can push Command, Shift, and the N key. We're going to call this folder JPEGs. We click on the Create button, or we can push the Return. And now I have JPEGs. I click Open, and it moves the JPEGs into that folder. Now you can go to Google Drive, go into the Assignments folder, create a folder with your last name, the assignment name, the date they're due, and upload this JPEGs and RAW folders into that, and your assignment is complete. After all that work, you're going to want to back up your files. Now, it's up to you how many of the files you shot on an assignment you want to keep. You may only want to keep the raw files and the images you actually processed into JPEGs from each assignment. That's up to you. I keep a lot more than I really probably need, but make sure after all that work, if something happens with the shared Google Drive that we have in class, you don't want to lose your files. So make sure you use another option, either your own personal Google Drive, another cloud service, or an external hard drive, but back up those files you spent all that time working on. You don't want all that work to go to waste.